It seems like these days, if you're looking at a premium knife, the checklist goes M390 titanium frame lock, but more so the blade steel, M390 or 20CV or CTS 204P for this matter. They're all the same steel, just made by different companies. Today, we're going to be talking about why CTS 204P or M390 or 20CV has been so overhyped and why they're appearing on so many premium knives. This is a discussion worth having because people just don't understand. Most people will prize edge retention in a knife steel over just about everything else. A few people think that corrosion resistance is the best, but based on my findings with polling the community, edge retention is still king. And when popular resources talk about M390, they tend to talk about the edge retention first. The shocking thing about that is that it might not actually be as good as you think it is for edge retention. It might actually be a little bit better for some other things than you had previously understood. How's it going, everybody? I'm Rollshambo, the connoisseur and collector of all things sharp and shiny. And today we're doing another episode of Steel Snobs, the series where I attempt to break down information on knife steels in an attempt to make it easy to digest and easy to understand for those of us who are not metallurgists, like Dr. Laren Thomas. And we will, in fact, be using some of his findings as well, since we have a comparison tool that we'll be using to see just how high certain steels rank with certain properties. Are you ready to go? Let's talk about M390's 204P and 20CV. My friends, it's time to clear the record on M390 and 20CV and lesser used CTS 204P. And once again, these are all the same steel, just made by different companies. M390 is made by Böhler Udenholm. 20CV is manufactured by Crucible Industries, and CTS 204P is made by a company called Carpenter, also known as Carpenter 204P. However, a lot of people seem to be getting it twisted when it comes to what exactly these steels are meant for. And to get to the bottom of why this misunderstanding has occurred, we need to talk about the history of M390. For the sake of my sanity, for the rest of the video, I'm just going to be referring to it as M390, since that seems to be the trigger word that gets everyone hot and bothered when they start looking at knife steels. M390 was originally made by Böhler Udenholm in the late 80s as an alternative to their previous steel manufactured earlier that decade called K190. You see, Böhler's alternative goal was to have a powder metallurgy steel that had higher wear resistance, also known as edge retention, as well as really good corrosion resistance. They drastically increased the amount of chromium in the existing mixture for K190. M390 was initially made for the plastics industry as a manufacturing steel, something where this industry had previously used steels like K190 and D7 and 10V. So with the goal being high corrosion resistance and high wear resistance, they had set the bar pretty high. It wasn't until later on in the 90s that they started using M390 in knives because the plastics industry had been taking up the largest stock of this steel. Now here's some irony for you. The greatest use of M390 or CTS 204P or 20CV in knives did not actually come from Böhler. It came from a company called Latrobe Steels, which is owned by Carpenter and based right here at home in the United States. With that brief history lesson in the bag, it's time to talk about the qualities of M390. And when we're talking about knife steel properties, it comes down to three categories. The The first one is toughness, then you have edge retention or wear resistance, and then lastly, but definitely not least, is corrosion resistance. Now, if you were to ask a general mass of people what the most important property on a knife to them is, they'd probably tell you edge retention, because it does not matter how tough or how corrosion resistant a knife is if it doesn't cut very well, since that is in fact the primary purpose of a knife. Is edge retention everything in the end? No, but it does count for a lot, and people do know this. With all of that being said, it also doesn't matter how sharp your knife is if every time you take it out of the bag, it corrodes. Corrosion resistance is also very important, because the more you use a knife, the more opportunity you have for it to corrode over time. And so you need to really pay attention to everything here. When we look at these knife steel properties, often there's a bit of a trade-off. If you have a higher amount of edge retention, for example, it's very common to have a lower amount of toughness. The harder a steel is, the more brittle it is. And the more brittle it is, usually we don't have as good of corrosion resistance either. So getting a nice happy medium there is always a little tough when we talk about designing steels specifically made for knives. For example, a lot of people liked old school D2 when properly heat treated, but the biggest slam against D2 was the fact that it didn't have the greatest corrosion resistance. If we were to take a look at Dr. Laren Thomas's knife steel property rating system based on a scale of 1 to 12 for edge retention, M390 comes in at 6.5. Its toughness is relatively low at 3.5, and the corrosion resistance is actually the greatest property that it has at a 9. On his knife steel property rating list, 10 is in fact the highest you can go for corrosion resistance, and so you can see that M390 actually shines through not in edge retention, but in fact in corrosion resistance. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because in today's day and age, here in 2023, you can't look at knives, especially premium knives, without seeing 20CV or M390. For example, I took a look in my display case and found several knives that actually do have M390 or 20CV. For example, this TRM Shadow is made with CPM 20CV. We have this Precision Knife Works Worn Tack, also in 20CV. This Chavez Redemption 229 in M390. And then lastly, we have this Arcane Designs Plexus in M390 as well. So with all of these premium knives being made in this steel, and with most people caring about edge retention, what steel should we actually be looking at if edge retention is in fact king, but we still care about corrosion resistance? I went ahead and sorted the list of Laren Thomas's website for knife steel properties based on 6.5 edge retention or higher. On this list, M390 is actually going to have the lowest amount of edge retention, and that's not to say that it's not good, it's just pointing out that it's not the best. So if edge retention is truly what you care about, you could in fact look at steels like 10V, 15V, K390, Maximit, Rex 121, Vanitas 8, ZDP 189, ZMax, S110V, M398, S125V, S60V, and S90V. Now, that's not to say that all of those other steels have better properties across the board. For example, while Maximit has an 11 in edge retention, it only has a 4.5 when it comes to corrosion resistance, which is very similar to what we see with D2 tool steel. Likewise, ZDP 189 also has much better edge retention than M390, but it also has lower toughness and lower corrosion resistance. That isn't to say that we don't have steels that are better across the board. For example, we have S90V, which has the same amount of toughness as M390 with much higher edge retention and very marginally less corrosion resistance. Just like M390, S90V is largely considered a stainless steel, so you don't have to worry that much about it rusting. With all of that being said, I have one big problem with M390 being used and touted as an amazing knife steel. It's not that I disagree with its potential properties of the steel itself, but rather how it's manufactured when put into knives. For example, because of its high wear resistance at 60 to 62 HRC and beyond, it makes it much harder to machine. So we're actually seeing gigantic waves of knives being made with premium price tags with an average HRC of below 60. Now, some people might say, well, with the lower hardness, it's going to make it more durable, right? Not necessarily. Dr. Laren Thomas mentioned this in the response to a comment on his website when someone asked him this very same question. And he also refers to S35VN, which is a steel that it actually gets tougher the harder that it gets. However, you might be wondering, why is it that these companies are making it with suboptimal hardness if it's going to result in suboptimal properties when you go to actually use the knife? The answer is this: it's all about cost. At a higher hardness level, M390 is extremely difficult to manufacture. It goes through belts on grinders a lot quicker, it's harder and takes longer to machine properly, especially with water jets, and it does tend to have a higher cost of manufacturing. Which brings me to my next point, which is D2 steel. Now, I already did a video on D2 steel, and if you want to check that out, I will link it here at the end of this video. However, D2 steel used to be touted as an extremely good knife steel. However, when mass manufacturers got their hands on it, they started to heat treat it to a lower HRC. Why? Because they wanted to lower their cost and ease of manufacturing. We are now starting to see the same thing with M390, and I can't help but wonder how long it's going to take before we start looking at M390 the same way that we look at D2 tool steel when we go to demonize it with new developments and new steels later on. I hope this video cleared up some questions you may have if you've been confused looking at information on knife steels on other websites. The goal of this video is always to educate and to offer my opinion based on current industry standards while also using sources that are reliable, like Dr. Laren Thomas's Knife Steel Nerds website. And if you want to dig deeper into the rabbit hole, I will link to his website down below because that's where I get a lot of my information. In my opinion, he is in fact the best resource for us in the knife community, and I think you could do a lot worse when it comes to sourcing your information. Something that I do want to mention is not that I hate M390 or 20CV or CTS 204P. I definitely don't. What I do hate is the level of misinformation that's out there when websites, manufacturers, and knife reviewers get their hands on a knife with M390 and immediately start talking about its edge retention, despite the fact that there is plenty more steels out there that have way better edge retention. For example, if you see a knife in S30V, that is a blade steel that is actually very easy to manufacture, designed by Chris Reeves in concert with Crucible Industries specifically for knives. That's why it's easier to manufacture. I mention this because you're going to get more consistent results with a steel like that because it's meant to be easier to manufacture. So those manufacturers have to sacrifice less to properly heat treat it to the proper hardness. When looking for your next knife, keep these things in mind and don't be afraid of other knife steels. There's always going to be innovation in this sector and we're going to see more steels out there. Just don't be surprised if all of a sudden M390 becomes the new D2. If you want to watch more awesome knife content just like this, make sure you click on the video that pops up next.